This is Suetonius. He was a Roman writer from the early 2nd century CE, and he wrote this book, The 12 Caesars, about the first 12 Caesars, Julius Caesar and the 11 emperors of Rome that followed him. And it's a good read. All the best bits of this period of history are in Suetonius. He didn't mind repeating salacious rumours or graphic content, regardless of how true it probably was. All of the really juicy stuff from early imperial Roman history is in here. The incest, the murders, the conspiracies. That's Suetonius's bread and butter. It is probably not the most reliable historical source from the period, but it sure as hell is the most entertaining. Today, we're going to be going through Suetonius's 12 Caesars, and we're going to be ranking them in one of these tier lists. We will be ranking them according to, general competency. Did they leave the empire in a better position than how they found it? But mostly it'll be a vibes-based judgment. I want to dissuade you of any notion that this is objective or in any way academic. We're just having fun. Your list will probably differ from mine. Feel free to let me know all about that in the comments below. This video will have basically no academic value, and I will be citing no sources. But if you're interested, it's pretty much all from Suetonius, with a couple of cameos from Cassius Dio and Tacitus. And we're going to start with the original Big C, Gaius Julius Caesar. The guy who was so cool, he basically broke a 5-century-year-old republican system. Caesar's story is that he was a very successful general. He conquered Gaul, which is most of modern France and bits of Belgium and the Low Countries, bringing this area into the empire and making himself very wealthy. But he also made a lot of other politicians very jealous because he had been so successful and was so popular. And so they declared him an enemy of the state. But Julius Caesar didn't stand for this. He took a page out of Sulla's book and marched his army on Rome. Eventually, after a long civil war, he defeated his main rival, Pompey the Great, and he returned to Rome as basically the most powerful man in the empire. But on top of all of this, Caesar comes across as a pretty cool dude, a real Renaissance man, even though it's going to be 1500 years until the Renaissance begins. He was intelligent, he was creative, he loved poetry and things, and he pushed boundaries, not only politically, but in things like fashion. So he got these wrist-length sleeves for his toga, and he used to wear his belt at a bit of an angle and very loosely, which at the time was very avant-garde. When Julius Caesar was a young man, Sulla, the dictator at the time, used to say, "Beware that boy in the loose clothing." At least a fair few Romans seem to have found this pretty attractive about him, because he led an extremely active love life. Caesar slept with everyone. The wives of his enemies, the wives of his friends, kings, This led to him getting the nickname every woman's husband and every man's wife. But all the charm and charisma in the world wouldn't stop some people from turning against him once he made himself dictator for life. When he was around, the Romans still governed themselves as a republic. They had elected officials. They defined themselves as not being a monarchy, not having kings. And dictator for life is just a little bit too close to king. The Romans didn't like it. They thought it was wrong. Minus 1,000 aura points for Caesar for declaring himself dictator for life, as the kids say. I apologise sincerely to Gen Alpha for that shameless appropriation of your culture. So they murdered Caesar. Quite famously. Julius Caesar was typically very good at feeling out public opinion, but he really slipped up towards the end of his life. He didn't realise quite how much his assumption of absolute power had really rubbed some people the wrong way. One more fun fact about Caesar, by the way. He was balding. His hairline receded, but he was very self-conscious about this. So he used to comb his hair forward, in like a comb-over, and that's why he always wore his laurel wreaths. Any opportunity he could, he'd wear the laurel wreaths, because it meant people couldn't see how bald he was. And this, I think, to an extent contributed to one of my favourite phenomenons in ancient art, and that is Caesar getting gradually better looking over time. He starts as this fairly normal-looking, middle-aged Italian man with a receding hairline, and within a century he's turned into this shovel-jawed, perfectly chiseled demigod of a man. So Julius Caesar is A tier. Pretty hard to beat the original. Our next Caesar is Augustus, or Octavian, as he was known earlier in his life. He was Julius Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son. And after his adopted father's murder, he went on a campaign of revenge in a series of civil wars, first against Caesar's murderers, who had styled themselves the Liberators, Brutus and Cassius, and after he killed them, he fought against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Mark Antony had been an old right-hand man of Caesar's, and Cleopatra was the Queen of Egypt. Eventually, after about 10 years of civil war, he was successful, and Octavian was the most powerful man in Rome. But Rome, which had governed itself as a republic for centuries, had basically torn itself apart. So Octavian spent the next 8 years or so constructing a new political order, with himself at the centre of it. Octavian, who started calling himself Augustus, meaning the revered one, created the Principate. He called himself Princeps. This was a new title that he'd invented for himself, and it was essentially an autocracy. You know, he was an autocrat, he was in charge. We call them emperors today. But he didn't sell it like this. He kept the Senate involved in government, even if it was a little bit farcical. And he sold his new political order not as the autocracy that it really was, but as a rejuvenated republic, of which he was merely the leading citizen and the guardian. And, you know, a lot of people understood this for what it was. But frankly, even though the Republic had always been very close to the heart of Romans, they'd gone through about 2 decades of nearly non-stop civil war at this point. The Roman people just wanted a bit of peace and quiet. They wanted things to run smoothly for just a few years, and Augustus provided them with that. The fact that he had taken so much power for himself, more than any Roman had ever gotten away with before, didn't really matter, because he kept the peace and he ran things smoothly. You really get the sense that Augustus spent a lot of his time basically cleaning Rome up. Lots of temples had been destroyed, so he repaired them. He revised the legal system. He revised the senatorial roles. He reformed the army. He did all kinds of stuff like that, stuff that needed to be done, and that lay the foundations for an empire that could last for several more centuries. He also expanded the empire pretty effectively. You know, he added Egypt to his territories. He did mess up in Germany a little bit, though. He sent troops into Germania, and 3 legions were wiped out at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Little bit of a setback there. But one of Augustus's main talents was, I think, the most important talent that a leader in a position like emperor needs to have. Not necessarily being uber-talented at everything himself, but very good at identifying talent in others and keeping those people round. Augustus surrounded himself with competent people. The 2 best examples are 2 of his friends, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa and Maecenas. Agrippa was a talented soldier and a great civil engineer type figure. So Agrippa got to work reforming the Roman army, training up a new Roman navy using a big inland lake that he'd constructed himself, and building things in Rome. He built many of the Roman aqueducts. He built the Pantheon, where you can still see today his name is on it. And through Maecenas, Augustus could patronize the arts. Maecenas invited all of the creative types, all of the most talented ones from round the empire to come to Rome. And this kick-started a golden era of Latin literature and art. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Augustus could be very cold. Like, very, very cold. His entire life was politics. Everything he did was part of the great performance of a politician. His last words on his deathbed reportedly were, "So, have I played my part well in the comedy of life?" And when people said, "Yes, you have," he said, "Then applaud." You know, he saw the farce for what it was, and he played the role, and he expected everyone around him to do the same. Some of his friends and family were fine with this. His sister Octavia, for example, was happy to play the loyal Roman housewife type role. Agrippa was happy to basically put his own interests second and always act in Augustus's interests. But this didn't go for everyone. His only biological child was a daughter called Julia. And Julia was used by her father as a political pawn, married off for political reasons, basically whenever Augustus wanted. And clearly she wasn't too happy about this because she rebelled. And the way that she rebelled was by having affairs, lots of them, mostly with high-ranking Romans. This was very embarrassing for Augustus, that his own daughter went round sleeping with fellow politicians, especially as he was trying to portray his family as like this paragon of virtue, this perfect Roman family. It was a real scandal. This episode also led to that excellent scene in I, Claudius, when Brian Blessed, playing the Emperor Augustus, interrogates the Senate after he realises this has happened, and he realises how many of them have a relationship with his daughter, and he eventually erupts and says, "Is there anybody here who has not slept with my daughter?" I love you, Brian Blessed, you absolute national treasure. But despite the occasional setback and disasters in his family life, Augustus was the model emperor. Literally, all future emperors modelled themselves on him, and as the real first, we can't justify ranking him any lower than S tier. Fair play, Augustus. Augustus was replaced by his stepson, Tiberius. Nobody wanted Tiberius to be emperor. Even Augustus didn't think much of him, but he got the job basically on the merit that he had outlived all of the other potential heirs, because Augustus had lived for so long. Augustus had never planned to live to an old age. He was in ill health for most of his life, and he seems to have prepared himself for a likely early death. But he did end up living well into his 70s. But in doing so, he seems to have used up basically all of his family's luck, because all of his other family members and potential heirs, the ones he liked, died young. And eventually he had to turn to his semi-estranged stepson to succeed him because there was no one else left. At first, things went pretty well. Tiberius lacked the charm of the first two Caesars, but he was a competent general, he was good with money, he treated people with respect. But as time went on, quite a lot of these traits morphed into darker qualities. So, for example, the fact that he was quite sensible with money eventually turned into tight-fistedness and miserliness. He could also strike people as being really rather cold. Now, sure, Augustus could be cold as well, but there was something about Tiberius. There was something really quite ungenuine about him. He had all of the manners and the politeness expected of a Roman aristocrat, but there was no warmth behind that clearly forced smile that he was putting on. As he got older, he became increasingly reclusive. Eventually, he left Rome altogether and went to go and live on the island of Capri in the Bay of Naples, where he got up to some activities. The kinds of activities that some rich and powerful people get up to on islands. I'm not going to describe in any detail what they are, but if you're curious in looking for yourself, go onto Google, type in Suetonius' Life of Tiberius, go onto the document that the University of Chicago has very kindly uploaded for free, go to the search bar, Control F or Control G, depending on your machine, and type in the word nibble, N-I-B-B-L-E, and it'll take you to the details, but do so at your own risk. His absence from Rome had a pretty adverse effect on how things went. The emperor was meant to rule, and he wasn't even in the city he was ruling. This led to the Praetorian prefect, a man called Sejanus, attempting to seize power for himself. Now, Tiberius found out about this and had Sejanus killed, but he then got increasingly paranoid and brutal, and he started murdering people if he even suspected that they might be plotting against him. By the time he died, Tiberius was one of the most hated men in Rome. Honestly, though, I feel a little bit sorry for him. I think his cold and off-putting persona was just the result of a life that was characterized by loss. So when he was younger, Tiberius was very close with his older brother Drusus. The two of them did everything together. But one day, when he was in his 30s, Drusus fell from his horse whilst on campaign in Germany with the Roman army, and the wound killed him. He died. and Tiberius was deeply affected by this. He walked all the way back to Rome in front of his brother's coffin in deep mourning. On top of this, when he was young, Tiberius married a woman called Vespasian, and he fell deeply, deeply in love with her. They had a very happy marriage, but it wasn't a politically expedient marriage. His stepfather, Augustus, wanted him to marry his own daughter Julia for political reasons, and this is part of how Augustus did things. He didn't care who his relatives married and who they were in love with. They would do it according to his own plan for his own politics. So Tiberius was forced, very reluctantly, to divorce the wife he loved so much and begin a very unhappy marriage with the emperor's daughter, Julia. One story says that one day Tiberius was so affected by this, he caught a glimpse of Vespasian in the streets of Rome out of the corner of his eye, and he was so upset that he spent the rest of the day crying and looking very depressed. And this sickened Augustus, who orchestrated things to make sure that Tiberius and Vespasian never saw each other again. Tiberius would also outlive his only surviving son, and his nephew, Germanicus, who many people would accuse him of murdering, an accusation that followed him round for the rest of his life. In a life that had been characterised by such loss and so little love, is it any surprise that Tiberius ended out being a depressive, reclusive, paranoid old man? Anyway, C tier. Tiberius really was hated by the end of his life. Supposedly when he died, the people of Rome rejoiced and chanted, "Into the Tiber with Tiberius." They might not have been quite so happy had they known who his replacement would be, because his replacement would be a guy called Caligula, and Caligula is the model for a tyrannical, megalomaniacal, just lunatic of an emperor. History remembers Caligula as, well, Caligula, but that wasn't his name. His name was Gaius, and that's what people called him at the time. We call him Caligula because of a nickname he got. So when he was a boy, his father, Germanicus, the Emperor Tiberius's nephew, was often at war in Germania. That's why he got the name Germanicus. And whilst he was at war, he had his family with him. So Caligula, or Gaius, spent a lot of his youth in the army camps as he was a little boy. And the soldiers were very, very fond of him. They treated him like a little mascot. And they even designed and made for him a tiny miniature soldier's outfit for him to wear, including little caligae, which are the sandals that Roman soldiers wear. So he became known as Caligula, or Little Boots, which is very, very cute. It would be very cute had he not turned out a psychotic monster. Caligula's father died young, so when he was still a child, Caligula was sent to the island of Capri to live with his great-uncle, the Emperor Tiberius. Now, I mentioned before the kinds of things that went on Capri according to our ancient sources, and that they're pretty non-PG. Now, that could well be true, or maybe it was made up to make the Emperor Tiberius seem even worse. We can't know for sure. But whatever happened on Capri, it really fucked Caligula up. When he became emperor, after great-uncle Tiberius's death, Caligula assumed basically absolute power. This wasn't new. The last two emperors had basically been solely in charge of the empire as well, but Caligula was the first to really act like it. So I've got my list here of things Caligula did according to Suetonius. I don't usually read off of a script like this, but I really want to make sure that I don't miss out a single anecdote for you guys, because these are historical gold. So he committed incest with his sisters. Good start. Then he exiled two of them. He used to forcefully steal the wives of senators and then have his way with them. He found disabled and deformed people and would make them fight to the death for his amusement. He forced parents to watch as he tortured their children to death. And he wouldn't let them get out of it either. There's one story of a father basically writing to the emperor saying, "Unfortunately, I'm incredibly, incredibly sick, bedbound even, so I'm unable to attend the execution of my son." And Caligula, being a kindly, sadistic man, sent a luxurious litter to carry him to the execution in style. This one's diabolical. He removed the canopies used for shade in theatres at the hottest part of the day and then forbade anyone from leaving so he could sit and watch people boil in the August Italian sun. That is just hideous. He made senators run alongside his chariot as an exercise in humiliation. He dismissed officials who forgot his birthday. To be fair, that's quite the oversight. And he supposedly once threatened to make his horse a consul. Caligula also has some spectacularly iconic phrases, like brutal, but quite fun nevertheless. Here's a few of them. To his sisters, who he had exiled to an island in the Mediterranean because he was displeased with them, he reminded them that he had swords as well as islands. He once told his grandmother, "Remember, I can do anything I want to anyone I want." When he signed off execution orders, he referred to this as clearing his accounts. He once remarked that he wished all of Rome had but one neck. And of course, my favourite, the famous, iconic with a capital I, "Let them hate me, so long as they fear me." Oof, that's 10 out of 10 tyrannical language right there. Awesome, love it. Caligula did so many cruel and, frankly, frivolous things that he quickly emptied the empire's coffers, which Augustus and Tiberius had worked so hard to fill. And in response to this issue, he murdered rich people and took their things. Basically, Caligula made no effort to hide the fact that he had absolute power. He even insisted that people start worshipping him as a god. This is in contrast to Augustus and Tiberius, who had tried very hard to make sure that people knew that they weren't trying to be gods, they weren't trying to be kings, even if in effect they basically were. So it's not really surprising that they murdered Caligula. Brutally. And that was the end of him. When I was at university, myself and a few of my course mates decided to watch the film Caligula, which everyone had warned us was disgusting and horrific. And it was. It was really, really hard to watch. And one of my course mates straight up got up, declared that he had had enough, and walked out the room and left and didn't watch the end of the film. And I did not blame him slightly for that. It was just... I really enjoyed it. But it was a terrifically hard watch at points. Caligula was replaced by old Uncle Claudius. And I love Claudius. I have a real soft spot for him. He's the ultimate underdog. There's basically two ways that you can look at Claudius. Either he was this bumbling idiot who, through luck alone, fell into the most powerful position of in the empire, or he was like this 4D chess player who had the whole thing planned out. And he was just brilliant. It's probably a little bit of both, but basically Claudius was the kind of guy that no one expected to be emperor. But he turned out to be fairly good at it. To start with, he conquered Britain, which is where I live, so, you know, fair play for that, I guess. And he built things, and he ran things fairly effectively, and frankly, after Caligula, people were just happy to have someone who wasn't completely nuts in charge. But there were elements of his rule that were a bit darker. For example, although he wasn't as overtly tyrannical as Caligula, he was still a little bit more monarchic than an emperor was than it was thought he should be. So Augustus and Tiberius had ruled very much in partnership with the Senate. Even though they were in charge, they always deferred to the Senate, and they used senators to fill the magistracies and the official roles of government. Claudius had very little support in the Senate, and he didn't trust them. He had been made emperor by the soldiers, by the Praetorian Guard. The first emperor, but not the last, to be made by the Praetorian Guard. So the Senate, who didn't have a say in his ascension, didn't really like him that much. So instead of ruling from the Senate House with senators, he ruled from his own palace, usually using freedmen, slaves that he had freed. This was reminiscent to the Romans of a monarch. This is what a king did. This is what the Hellenistic kingdoms did in the East, who were people that the Romans were used to feeling pretty contemptuous about. So this wasn't a good look. His personal life was also a bit of a disaster. The wife he had when he came to power was a woman called Messalina, a woman who had constant affairs with lots of other men that everybody knew about apart from Claudius. Claudius did eventually have her put to death after she married another man, probably in an attempt to usurp power from him. His next wife, his niece Agrippina, and no, that was not normal at the time, he had to change the law to make this incestuous marriage legal, was also perhaps not a great move. So, okay, a bit of backstory. Agrippina, I think, gets shafted by our sources a bit. I think they portray her as being a little bit more scheming and a little bit more conniving than she actually was. And I don't really buy into the story that she murdered Claudius. She might have done, but I don't think we know that for sure. That's what the sources say. The sources say his last wife, Agrippina, murdered him. Probably not. Claudius was already old and in ill health. But his marriage to her did create one massive issue that he never solved, one of succession. Nobody knew if, when Claudius died, he wanted to be succeeded by his natural son, Britannicus, from a previous marriage, or by his stepson, a guy called Nero. And Claudius's failure to make a decisive and clear decision regarding who he wanted to succeed him set the empire up for the disastrous reign of Nero after he died, and he probably also set his own son up to be murdered. So Uncle Claudius gets C tier, and a lot of that is just because I personally like him. Our next Caesar is the Emperor Nero. Now, in my mind, the image I have of the Emperor Nero has been forever shaped by his on-screen portrayal by Michael Sheen, the absolute living legend and national treasure, who perfectly encapsulated Nero's descent into megalomania and paranoia and frankly just madness. It was part of a BBC documentary series, I think called Rome, Rise and Fall, or something like that. And the rest of it was fairly average. This episode slapped. It was so good. Michael Sheen, you're perfect in everything you do. I know you're not watching this, why would you be? You're too busy being one of the greatest actors that this island has ever produced. But just in case you are, know that I appreciate you. But Michael Sheen, brilliant as he is in the role, looks nothing like Nero. This is Michael Sheen. This is the Emperor Nero. Without a doubt, the most hideous man to be Emperor of Rome up until Honorius. I mean, just look at him. Look at that. That's the worst face that a person can have. He looks so smug. He looks like the kind of guy who, if he were alive today, would make being an anti-feminist like the key part of his personality. You're just so unappealing. You're just the most ugly man who ever lived. Oh, it's just awful. You've probably heard quite a bit about Nero, by the way. You know, he's quite a famous emperor. You've probably heard the story of him callously playing the fiddle whilst Rome burned. But initially, when he first came to power, for his first 5 years, things looked promising. He was so good in his first 5 years that he effectively tricked people into thinking he might be the best emperor to rule Rome since Augustus. And this was largely due to his advisors. Nero was steered towards sensible policies by, firstly, his mother, Agrippina, who had been at this game of imperial politics for decades now, Burrus, the prefect of his Praetorian Guard, a capable soldier, and Seneca, who was a veteran statesman and a Stoic philosopher. These three effectively ran the empire and showed Nero how to do it. But eventually, Nero grew up and started making his own decisions, and he decided to make the worst possible decisions he could. He started by murdering his then-wife, Octavia, and his mother, Agrippina, which was as shocking to the Romans then as it would be to us now. Burrus, that Praetorian prefect, then died of natural causes, and Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, the last competent statesman that Nero trusted, well, he was suspected of being involved in a conspiracy against the emperor's life, and forced to die, basically. And with that, Nero was untethered, and the Reign of Terror could begin. Well, sort of. The Reign of Terror really began after 64 CE, which is when the Great Fire of Rome happened. Now, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't seem like Nero played the fiddle whilst Rome burned in some act of disregard for the loss of human life that he was seeing. He might have gotten a verse or two of the fall of Troy in there, but he spent most of his time actually being helpful. He provided aid to the victims of the fire and eventually sorted it out. It was afterwards, during the reparations, that things got weird. He decided to use the space that had been cleared by the fire to build a giant golden palace to himself, including a 30-metre tall statue of him, the Emperor Nero. Nero truly had an artist's soul, but he seems to have also lacked an artist's talent. He really wanted to be like a singer, songwriter, actor, a performer on stage. Now, you know, who am I to judge someone for following their dreams? I mean, I'm a small-scale history YouTuber, for God's sake. But to the Romans, who were seeing their emperor do this, it was distasteful, and it came across as being like a national disgrace. There are these stories of him droning on stage, whilst women gave birth in the theatre because they couldn't leave, and men would pretend to be dead so they could be carried out. He also insisted on competing in the Olympic Games as a chariot racer, but he was bad at it, so he crashed his chariot almost fatally. But he still won the gold medal because, you know, he was the emperor. Of course he was going to win gold, whether he finished the race or not. All of this is kind of laughable, but it also had a far, far darker side. He at one point went into a rage so fierce, he kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death. Afterwards he felt guilty about this, so he found a male slave, a guy called Sporus, who somewhat resembled his deceased wife. He castrated the man, and had him dressed as a woman and married him in a formal ceremony, as a way of kind of undoing his heinous crime, which is mad. He was the first emperor to persecute Christians, Christianity being a fairly new religion at the time. He murdered lots of aristocrats to steal their property. He was generally a nasty guy, so it's not really any surprise that eventually he was murdered. Well, he wasn't murdered. He knew he was going to be murdered. The whole of Rome turned against him, so he did the job himself. His last words being, "The world is losing a great artist," which makes me hate him so much, I actually kind of love it. I should also mention here that Nero's legacy is kind of mixed. Our sources, pretty much across the board, describe him as a mad tyrant, and it was a good thing that people got rid of him. But not everybody felt that way. For years after his death, his grave always had fresh flowers on it. People continued to make flattering statues of the Emperor Nero. And years later, a man appeared in the eastern provinces claiming to be the Emperor Nero. He wasn't, he was an imposter, but the fact that he thought people might rally to him if he was the Emperor Nero shows that at least a few people probably liked him. Anyways, Nero, E tier. His reign was a disaster, but he's not quite as detestable as Caligula was. Okay, so Nero was dead, and with him the Julio-Claudian dynasty also died. There were no more heirs to Caesar and Augustus. Instead, the Roman Empire fell into a massive civil war in which 4 separate men declared themselves to be emperor in 1 year, creatively called the Year of the 4 Emperors. We're going to be going through these guys one at a time. The first person people turned to was Galba. He was a governor in Spain, an old, experienced, capable man who everyone agreed would make a great emperor, until he actually became emperor. Galba was incorruptible and harsh, which was the opposite of what people wanted. People wanted a lenient emperor who was open to the idea of bribery. That was what people were really after, and Galba was absolutely not that. So immediately people started falling out with him. But the last straw, only a few weeks into his reign, was when he named a man called Piso as his heir. No one wanted this guy to be emperor, so they murdered him and Galba, and they declared a man called Otho to be his replacement. Galba is E tier, frankly a bit pointless. The next emperor, Otho, had been a childhood friend of Nero's. As young men they had painted Rome red together with these tales of drinking parties and debauchery. You know, he had a bit of a bad reputation, did Otho. And he and Nero were such good friends that at one point they came up with a scheme. Nero had fallen in love with a woman called Poppaea, but he couldn't marry her yet because he was still married to Octavia, Claudia's daughter. and he hadn't quite got round to murdering his wife yet. So the plan was, Otho, as Nero's friend, would marry this Poppaea woman, and that would stop her from being swept up by some other man. And then Otho would kind of keep her on standby until Nero could murder his mother and wife and get round to marrying her himself. But there was a complication. At some point, Otho fell genuinely in love with the wife that he had married purely just to keep for Nero. So when Nero had killed his first wife and came to Otho asking, "Hey, can you divorce her now? My turn," Otho didn't go quietly. This led to the two old friends falling out, big time, and Otho went into a sort of informal exile in Spain. Otho must have been heartbroken to learn that not long after Nero had stolen his wife, he had murdered that wife as well. Really, really nasty stuff. So it's hardly a surprise that when his neighbour in Spain, Galba, raised the flag of rebellion against Nero, Otho joined in, hoping for a bit of revenge. Once Galba was in charge, Otho, quite reasonably, expected that the childless emperor, who was already 70 years old, would name him as his heir. He was his second in command, after all. But Galba didn't do this. He named a different man heir. So Otho then joined another plot to murder Galba and take power for himself. So far in his life, Otho had been a debauched playboy and a guy who got involved in murderous plots to kill emperors, and a usurper. He doesn't necessarily seem like the nicest guy, not the kind of guy you want in charge. But once he got the job, he took it pretty seriously. He had one task to start with. He had to deal with a rebellion on the Rhine, where the legions had raised their own candidate as emperor, a man called Vitellius. But Otho had this one bizarrely selfless trait. He could not stand the idea of a destructive civil war being fought on his behalf. So when it became clear that a quick victory probably wasn't going to happen, he left the world of his own free will to prevent that civil war that he hated so much. Otho gets D tier. Honestly, it's kind of refreshing after seeing so many emperors willing to kill and brutalize to protect themselves and their own power, to have a man who puts Rome first, even at the cost of his own life. The man who replaced Otho was the commander of the Rhine legions, Vitellius. Vitellius is portrayed by our ancient sources as a glutton. He was popular with his soldiers because he was lenient and let discipline go lax, and he's also portrayed as being an arrogant and callous man. Supposedly, when he saw the grave of Otho, his predecessor, he remarked, "A small grave for a small man." So he entered Rome, victorious as the new emperor, and immediately set about on a strict regime of partying. He held 4 feasts a day, just as standard, and the last of these feasts was basically just a drinking bout. As a result, our picture of him is as a grossly overweight drunkard. He also ruled with a real iron fist. So whilst he was in Rome, a usurper emperor called Vespasian was raised by the Eastern legions, and Vespasian had both family and supporters in the city of Rome. So as well as bankrupting the city with his non-stop parties, Vitellius also killed a lot of people. But the party could not last forever. Soon the legions loyal to Flavius Vespasian made their way to Rome, took the city, and found Vitellius hiding in a cupboard. They dragged him through the streets and executed him. And that was Vitellius. Vitellius is E tier. I'm glad he had fun while he could. The year of the 4 emperors finally ended when Vespasian took power. Vespasian founded the new Flavian dynasty, who, unlike the Julio-Claudians who came before them, weren't particularly blue-blooded. They were fairly obscure. They came from humble-ish origins. Vespasian had made his name in Britain during the reign of the Emperor Claudius, when during the invasion he had commanded a detachment of the Roman army, and this put him in the emperor's good books. But he fell out of those good books a few years later, when he attended a show put on by the Emperor Nero and fell asleep, which was a terrible crime to commit to the Emperor Nero, who was very sensitive about these kinds of things. And so he went into a sort of semi-exile in disgrace. But pretty soon he was reconciled, because everyone recognized he was a competent commander, and Rome suddenly needed a competent commander, because a group of Jewish rebels living in Judea had revolted against Roman rule. So Vespasian was sent to the eastern provinces to put this revolt down. It was whilst he was fighting against these Jewish rebels that Vespasian learned about the murder of the Emperor Nero, and eventually about the civil war that followed. A civil war that eventually he would get involved in by declaring himself emperor. Why not give it a go? You know, everyone else seemed to be. Whilst he was still in the east, legions loyal to him took the city of Rome, killed Vitellius, and made him the sole emperor, and he immediately got to work sorting Rome out. He halted construction on Nero's Golden Palace, and instead he constructed a monument that all Romans could enjoy. The Flavian Amphitheatre, perhaps the most enduring symbol of Rome's power, nowadays called the Colosseum. One of the most charming things about Vespasian is that he had a real sense of humour. He was funny and he didn't take himself too seriously. There was one point when a group of sycophants approached him and they'd created this fabricated family tree that linked his family to the founding of Rome. And Vespasian knew this was nonsense, so he just burst out laughing in front of everyone. There's one story of him going to see basically the equivalent of a stand-up comedian in Roman times, and he loved these kind of events, and this stand-up comedian was making fun of people in the audience, and Vespasian said, hey, make fun of me. Would you make fun of your emperor? And you know, the comedian, any other emperor, you'd be a very nervous comedian to do this. But he didn't miss a trick. He didn't miss a beat. He turned to the emperor and he said, of course, I'd be delighted to, but I'll wait for you to finish relieving yourself first. This was a reference to Vespasian's resting facial expression, which people often joked made him look constipated. And the emperor laughed. He found this very funny. He often laughed at himself, and he didn't mind when people made jokes at his expense, or when they addressed him not necessarily in the most formal way. He wasn't that kind of guy. But his humour could be cutting too at times. So at one point he made a speech, and it all went down very well and everyone clapped. But afterwards a senator approached him and corrected him on his pronunciation of certain words. And Vespasian said thank you very much, but for the rest of his life he always mispronounced this senator's name, just as a little reminder of that one occasion, and a little joke. There's another story that comes from when, during the reign of the Emperor Nero, when he fell asleep whilst Nero was giving one of his performances, and he was dragged out and thrown out of the theatre, and the bouncer on the door, the guy who threw him out, was very rude when he did so. He used some very rude phrases. And later, when Vespasian was emperor, this same doorman came up to him to apologise, and he said, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to be so rude to you as I kicked you out. And Vespasian laughed. He said, it's all in the past, don't worry about it. And then he showed the man the door and kicked him out using the same rude phrase that this guy had used before towards him. And he did all of this in good humour. You know, it was always, it's only a joke. But there was this underlying message. He never let people forget that he was emperor, even as he let them get away with making jokes about him. Vespasian also sometimes used this sense of humour to mask some of his less flattering qualities. So Nero, and the civil war that followed his death, had left the empire bankrupt. And as a result, Vespasian had to be pretty miserly in his financial policy and introduce some very unpopular ideas, one of which was a toilet tax, a payment to use public latrines in Rome, which is the sign of a barbaric society when you start charging people to use the toilet. Like, really, that means that civilization is completely lost. And his son pointed this out. His son was called Titus, and he went, Father, this is ridiculous. You can't tax people for using public latrines. It's dirty money. And Vespasian took out a coin, sniffed it, and said, money doesn't stink. A joke, certainly, but it was also his way of dismissing a criticism of this genuinely very unpopular policy. But nevertheless, Vespasian never purged the Senate. He never went on a murderous spree. He never started any unsuccessful wars, and he undoubtedly left the empire in a better state than how he found it. And he even found an opportunity for a joke on his deathbed. When he was an old man, he was dying, lying in bed, and he was surrounded by attendants. And it suddenly occurred to him, he went, oh, an emperor ought to die standing up, not lying down like this. It's beneath my dignity. So the surrounding attendants have to spend a few minutes getting this old sick man onto his feet and propping him up. And as he died, Vespasian reportedly said, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god," which was a reference to the deification of dead Caesars. Dead emperors were often worshipped as gods, but Vespasian and many other Romans were perfectly cynical about this. They didn't necessarily believe it. So even his last words were a little joke. I love that about him. Love you, Vespasian, if you're up there. Vespasian is a solid B-tier emperor. Fair play, Flavius, you did a good job. When Vespasian's son, Titus, became emperor after his death, people were scared, because he had a reputation as a brutal man and he was largely hated. By the time he died, he was one of the most beloved emperors Rome had ever had. Prior to becoming an emperor, Titus's achievements had mostly been as a soldier, mostly crushing the Jewish revolt in Judea, which he did brutally by sacking Jerusalem and destroying the Second Temple of Solomon. This earned him a reputation as a harsh, unforgiving, merciless man. He also had a romantic relationship with an Eastern queen called Berenike, and this made the Romans nervous. They thought maybe Titus would be the Mark Antony to this second Cleopatra. But all these fears were in vain. When he became emperor, Titus changed his attitude and became a very gentle, generous man, and he reluctantly broke off his relationship with Berenike, realizing that it would be considered inappropriate now that he was emperor. He was such a nice and generous man that there's this one story of him having drinks with friends and, chatting about how things are going. And he realizes suddenly, I haven't done any favors for anyone today. I haven't helped anybody. I haven't done something charitable today. And he turns to his friends and he says, my friends, I have wasted a day. Sadly for Titus, his reign was marked by endless disasters outside of his control. Not long after he became emperor, Mount Vesuvius just fucking exploded and buried the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum beneath volcanic ash. Great news for us historians and for the Italian Ministry of Tourism, who now have a great site, a preserved Roman city. Disastrous for the people at the time, because lots of them died and those that survived were now homeless refugees. Titus did everything he could to relieve the suffering of these people, but shortly afterwards Rome was hit by a massive fire that burnt down a portion of the city, and this was followed by a plague that killed even more people. Titus really did do everything he could to make the situation better, but it clearly exhausted him, and a little after 2 years after he became emperor, Titus died at the age of 41. I'm going to give Titus B-tier status. He's up there with his dad, where he belongs. Titus was replaced by his younger brother, Domitian. Domitian was never meant to be emperor. He was his father Vespasian's second son, but Vespasian seems to have forgotten that he ever existed. Although Vespasian did have the proverbial heir and a spare, he loved his heir, Titus, so much that he didn't really give a shit about his spare. He wasn't to know that Titus would die relatively young and without any children, so he kind of just ignored Domitian. During the civil wars that would eventually put his father on the throne, Domitian was in Rome under the care of his uncle. He saw Vitellius murder his uncle, and he had to go into hiding for his own safety. When his father finally triumphed and came into the city as Rome's sole emperor, Domitian came and said, "Hi Dad, I survived, well done." And Vespasian presumably said, "Who are you?" "Oh, my other son, I see." And Domitian asked, "Can I have a place in your administration?" And his dad said, "No." And he said, "Can I stand beside you, and have like a place in your household?" And his dad said, "No." And he said, "Okay, can I take part in the triumphal parade where you and my older brother Titus are at the front in a chariot being cheered by everyone?" And Vespasian said, "Fine, but you have to ride on a horse far behind so that everyone in the city knows you are my least favourite child." Domitian only got to hold a real position of power once before he became emperor, and even that was just because his older brother felt sorry for him and gave up one of the honours Dad had given him so his little brother could have, at least something. All of this turned Domitian into a bitter and reclusive man who ended up spending most of his days at home by himself, picking the wings off flies. Which really isn't a good sign. When Titus suddenly died without an heir, Domitian became emperor, and he quickly began turning everyone against him. He was really harsh, he was arrogant, and he was merciless. He was a real stickler for conservative Roman values and ideals, many of which no one really believed in anymore. One of the most famous examples of this is when he found that the Vestal virgins had been having affairs. Vestal virgins were young priestesses who were in charge of taking care of the Vesta, the sacred fire in Rome, and they were meant to be chaste. A lot of people knew that they really weren't and didn't mind, but they were meant to be. And when Domitian discovered this, he insisted that the traditional ancient punishment for this crime be used, that the priestesses themselves be bricked up in a wall and left to starve to death, whilst the men that they had slept with would be beaten to death with wooden clubs. This was technically ancient Roman tradition. It was technically law, but it was one of those traditions and laws that people by this time found to be obsolete and frankly quite barbaric. He lacked his father's good sense of humour and his brother's charm. He once put a man to death because he remembered that this man had once made a joke at his expense years beforehand. He came down hard on playwrights and writers who he perceived as being critical of his regime, and he even put one senator to death for naming two of his slaves, Hannibal and Mago, both of whom were ancient enemies of Rome. Other emperors had been called princeps, first citizen. This was their title, it was their office. Emperors like Tiberius and Augustus used to recoil when people called them lord or gave them an extra title to flatter them, knowing that no, this would make them come across as too up themselves, basically. His own father, Vespasian, hadn't minded when people didn't even use his titles. People used to just call him by his name. You'd hail him as Vespasian, not as imperator or princeps. Domitian wasn't like this. Domitian wouldn't even settle for being called princeps or imperator. He had a new title for himself. Dominus et Deus is how he insisted on being referred to. Lord and God. It really wasn't surprising when they murdered him. Domitian was murdered in a fairly interesting conspiracy that I did a whole video on, and with that ends Suetonius' 12 Caesars. Domitian is a D-tier emperor. Not gonna lie, I think even that might be a bit harsh. Personally, I reckon our ancient authors are a bit harsh on him, and this might have something to do with the fact that 2 out of the 3 of our main sources about Domitian wrote in the direct aftermath of his murderer, during the reigns of the people who had replaced him, and therefore tacitly endorsed the murder of Domitian. But that's just my hunch. So there we have it, the 12 Caesars in a tier list. I have no doubt that quite a few of you disagree with me. Please tell me all about that in the comments. Thank you to all the new subscribers who have come in the last few months, and the new patrons, the ones whose names should be coming up the screen now, as well as the ones who have been with me for years at this point. Really appreciate you guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Have a good week, everybody.